In the 18th century, 13 British colonies stretched along the eastern coast of North America, from the rocky shores of New England down to the warm coastal plains of the South. Life in these colonies was built around farms, small towns, busy ports, growing trade, and an ever-expanding population of ordinary settlers who had built entire communities from nothing. For generations, most colonists proudly considered themselves loyal British subjects, protected by the laws, the navy, and the might of the world's most powerful empire. But everything began to shift after the French and Indian War, a long and costly conflict that left Britain victorious, but deeply in debt. Britain had accumulated enormous war debts, and its government in London believed that the American colonies, which had benefited from British protection, should now help pay the bill. One by one, new taxes and new regulations began reaching across the Atlantic, touching nearly every part of everyday colonial life, from the newspapers people read to the documents they signed. The Stamp Act required colonists to pay a tax on newspapers, legal documents, playing cards, and dozens of other printed materials, forcing colonial officials to purchase specially stamped paper for nearly every transaction. Colonists were furious, arguing that Parliament had no right to tax them when they had no elected representatives sitting in the British government to speak on their behalf. Their argument became famous in a simple, powerful phrase that would echo through the coming decade: taxation without representation was unacceptable. Across the 13 colonies, resistance grew quickly, bringing together merchants, farmers, dock workers, and political leaders who had never before stood united on anything. Facing fierce colonial backlash and boycotts, Britain eventually repealed the Stamp Act, but the relief was short-lived, and new taxes soon followed in its place. The Townshend Acts placed new duties on everyday imported goods such as glass, paper, paint, and tea, once again reaching directly into colonial households. Colonists responded the same way they had before, organizing widespread boycotts and refusing to purchase British products until the hated taxes were lifted. British authorities, unwilling to back down, answered by sending armed soldiers into the city of Boston, where political tensions were already dangerously high. The presence of British troops patrolling the streets turned ordinary political disagreements into something far more volatile and dangerous. On the evening of March 5th, 1770, a heated confrontation between soldiers and a crowd of angry townspeople erupted outside the customs house. In the chaos and confusion, British troops opened fire directly into the crowd, killing several colonists in an event that would become known forever as the Boston Massacre. Patriot leaders like Samuel Adams quickly seized on the tragedy, using the deaths to strengthen resistance against British authority throughout the colonies. Vivid images and dramatic newspaper reports spread the story from town to town, turning a chaotic street fight into a powerful symbol of British oppression. For a time, tensions appeared to cool, but the underlying dispute over taxation and control never truly disappeared beneath the surface. The British government continued to insist on its right to regulate colonial trade and impose duties as it saw fit. Tea, of all things, became especially controversial after Britain granted the East India Company special trading advantages that undercut colonial merchants. Many colonists believed this tea policy was simply another attempt to force Parliament's authority upon them without their consent. In Boston, resistance leaders decided that the incoming tea shipments could not simply be unloaded and accepted without protest. On the cold night of December 16, 1773, a determined group of colonists gathered near Boston Harbor under cover of darkness. Some disguised themselves, boarding the British tea ships anchored quietly in the harbor, while townspeople watched from the shore. Working through the night, they broke open hundreds of heavy wooden chests and threw the tea overboard into the cold, dark waters below. The dramatic event quickly became known around the world as the Boston Tea Party. Britain responded with fury, and the growing political crisis moved the colonies ever closer to open, armed rebellion. In response, Parliament passed a harsh series of new laws specifically designed to punish Massachusetts and forcefully restore British control over the rebellious colony. Colonists gave these harsh new laws a fitting name of their own: the Intolerable Acts. But instead of isolating Massachusetts as Britain had hoped, the punishment had the opposite effect, encouraging colonies from Georgia to New Hampshire to stand together in solidarity. Delegates from across the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the historic First Continental Congress, meeting to discuss a united colonial response. They debated fiercely over exactly how far their resistance should go and how the colonies might act together against British power. Meanwhile, back in Massachusetts, British officials attempted to seize and secure colonial military supplies before rebellion could take hold. In response, colonial militias began quietly gathering weapons, ammunition, and gunpowder, preparing for the very real possibility of war. Ordinary farmers and shopkeepers transformed themselves into citizen soldiers, forming local militia companies that became famously known as the Minutemen. By the early months of 1775, both sides understood, with growing dread, that another violent confrontation was becoming increasingly likely. Then, in April, British troops began marching quietly toward the towns of Lexington and Concord. Before dawn broke that fateful morning, colonial families across Massachusetts received urgent warnings that British soldiers were approaching, carried by riders racing through the darkness. The long British column moved steadily through the quiet countryside, completely unaware of just how quickly colonial resistance was spreading ahead of them. At Lexington Green, a small, determined group of Minutemen gathered in formation to face the approaching British regulars. For one long, tense moment, the two forces stood facing each other in silence, neither side certain of what would happen next. Then, suddenly gunfire erupted, and men fell dead and dying on the peaceful village green. The British column continued its march toward Concord, but colonial militia forces gathered in increasing numbers from farms and towns all around them. At Concord's North Bridge, colonial forces stood their ground and confronted British soldiers defending the crossing. Shots rang out once again, and the brief confrontation quickly escalated into a full-scale military engagement. As the exhausted British troops retreated back toward Boston, colonial militia harassed them relentlessly from roads, fields, and stone walls along the way. By the time the long, bloody day finally ended, the American Revolution had effectively and irreversibly begun. The fighting around Boston quickly developed into a much larger and more organized military confrontation. Thousands of colonial volunteers streamed in from across New England, gathering in makeshift camps that surrounded the occupied city. But the colonies still lacked something crucial: a single unified army under one central military command. In June, the Continental Congress made a fateful decision, selecting George Washington of Virginia to command the newly formed Continental Army. Washington left Philadelphia at once and traveled north to take personal command of the ragtag forces surrounding Boston. When he arrived, he found thousands of brave, determined soldiers, but an army that was poorly organized, badly disciplined, and desperately short on supplies. Washington immediately began the difficult work of inspecting troops, weapons, provisions, and defensive positions across the entire camp. That same summer, the brutal Battle of Bunker Hill demonstrated just how costly this coming war was truly going to become. The British ultimately captured the colonial position, but only after suffering devastating casualties during their repeated assaults up the hill. Washington now faced an enormous challenge ahead: transforming a loose collection of scattered militias into a genuine, disciplined fighting army. Throughout the long, difficult winter that followed, Washington worked tirelessly to strengthen his defenses surrounding occupied Boston. At Dorchester Heights, Continental soldiers labored through the night to secretly build powerful earthworks and gun emplacements overlooking the harbor below. When British commanders woke to see these formidable new American positions, they quickly realized that holding the city had become an impossible task. In March of 1776, British troops and thousands of Loyalist civilians were forced to evacuate Boston entirely by sea. With Boston finally secured, attention across the colonies shifted toward a far larger and more permanent question. Should the colonies formally seek complete independence from Britain? In Philadelphia, a young Thomas Jefferson began drafting a powerful document explaining exactly why separation from the British Empire had become necessary. Jefferson worked closely alongside other political leaders as they carefully revised and debated every word of the proposed declaration. Inside the Continental Congress, delegates argued passionately over the enormous risks of breaking permanently and irrevocably with the British Empire. Finally, on July 4th, 1776, Congress formally approved the Declaration of Independence. The colonies were no longer simply resisting unfair British policies. They had now boldly declared themselves a brand new, independent nation. But declaring independence on paper did not guarantee victory on the battlefield, and Britain's military response proved absolutely enormous. In the summer of 1776, one of the largest British military forces ever assembled gathered ominously in New York Harbor. This massive British invasion soon led to the devastating Battle of Long Island. Continental forces were completely overwhelmed, suffering heavy losses against the much larger and better-trained British and Hessian armies. Washington watched the crushing defeat unfold before his eyes and quickly realized that his entire army could be destroyed if it remained trapped on the island. Under the cover of darkness and thick fog, Continental soldiers narrowly escaped across the East River to the relative safety of Manhattan. The desperate retreat continued steadily northward as British forces pursued Washington's battered army through New York and across New Jersey. By December, the once hopeful Continental Army was exhausted, poorly supplied, and dangerously close to complete collapse. In this darkest hour, Washington gathered his remaining officers and planned a bold, desperate counterattack against Hessian forces stationed at Trenton. On Christmas night, his frozen, hungry army crossed the treacherous, ice-choked Delaware River under cover of darkness. At dawn, on December 26th, Washington's exhausted but determined soldiers marched steadily toward the sleeping town of Trenton. Inside the town, the Hessian troops remained largely unaware that any American attack was even approaching. Washington's forces suddenly burst into Trenton and opened fire, catching the surprised Hessian garrison completely off guard. After a short but fierce battle, the shocked Hessian forces surrendered, leaving their weapons and supplies behind on the snowy streets. This stunning victory completely transformed the mood of the struggling Continental Army, giving new life and hope to a revolution that had seemed nearly finished. Just days later, Washington struck again at Princeton, defeating British forces and forcing them to reconsider their entire position throughout New Jersey. These two victories did not end the long war, but they proved decisively that Washington's army could survive and even triumph against Britain's professional, battle-hardened forces. The revolution would continue for years to come, through countless battles, brutal shortages, painful defeats, crucial foreign alliances, and enormous personal sacrifice. Behind every soldier on the front lines stood ordinary Americans back home who supplied food, clothing, weapons, money, and unwavering support for the cause they believed in. The struggle that had begun with just 13 scattered colonies had grown into something far greater, a determined fight to build an entirely new nation, one that would change the course of history forever.